Richard Sterling sat in the back of his black sedan, watching the modest apartment building across the street. The 72-year-old billionaire had built an empire worth $40 billion, yet tonight he was just another anonymous figure in the shadows. His driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror with concern, but Richard waved him off. For 3 months, he'd been coming here every Tuesday and Thursday evening, always keeping his distance, always staying invisible. His adopted daughter, Emily, lived on the 3rd floor of that weathered building, and she had no idea her father was watching. The guilt that had consumed him for 20 years had finally driven him to this point. He'd made a terrible mistake decades ago, one that cost him the only family that ever mattered. Now, as his health declined and his days grew numbered, he needed to know if she was okay. He needed to understand the woman she'd become. And most importantly, he needed to know if there was any chance for forgiveness before it was too late. Emily Sterling, though she no longer used that last name, emerged from the building at exactly 6:45, just as she did every Tuesday. Richard's heart clenched as he studied her face through the tinted window. She looked so much like her late mother, Sarah, with the same determined jaw and intelligent eyes. At 35, Emily had grown into a remarkable woman, but Richard could see the weight she carried in her shoulders. She wore a simple waitress uniform from the diner down the street, nothing like the designer clothes she'd worn as a child in his mansion. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she carried a worn backpack that had seen better days. Richard's hands trembled as he reached for his phone, zooming in to capture these precious moments. He'd given up the right to be in her life 20 years ago when he'd chosen his new wife over his daughter. The memory of that day still haunted him. Emily's tears, her desperate pleas, his cold dismissal. He'd thrown away everything that mattered for a woman who'd eventually betrayed and left him. Now, watching Emily walk toward the bus stop, he wondered if he'd ever get the chance to tell her the truth. The next Thursday, Richard's private investigator, Marcus Chen, slid a manila folder across the mahogany desk. "Mr. Sterling, you're not going to like what I found," Marcus said quietly. Richard's stomach dropped as he opened the folder, his hands shaking with each page he turned. Emily wasn't just working at the diner, she was working 3 jobs, often pulling 16-hour days. Medical bills filled the folder, each one stamped with urgent payment notices. His brilliant daughter, who'd once dreamed of becoming a doctor, had dropped out of medical school after he'd cut her off financially. She'd sacrificed her future to care for someone else, but the file didn't say who. Richard's eyes blurred with tears as he read about her eviction notices, her maxed-out credit cards, her desperate attempts to stay afloat. This was his fault. Every hardship she faced was because he'd chosen his pride and his new wife over the daughter who'd needed him most. He'd told himself that cutting her off would teach her strength and independence. Instead, he'd nearly destroyed her. Richard continued his surveillance, but now with a different purpose. He needed to understand the full scope of Emily's life, to see what she'd built from the ashes he'd left her in. On Tuesday night, he followed her from the diner to a small community center in the poorest part of town. His confusion grew as he watched her enter the building, carrying bags of supplies. Through the window, he could see her setting up for what appeared to be a class. Young faces, teenagers mostly, some children, gathered around her with eager expressions. She was teaching them, but the investigator's report hadn't mentioned anything about this. Richard moved closer, positioning himself where he could hear through the partially open window. "Remember," Emily's voice carried into the night, "education is the one thing no one can ever take from you. I learned that the hard way." Her students hung on every word as she helped them with their homework, providing encouragement and wisdom beyond her years. Richard realized with a start that she was volunteering, giving her precious free time to kids who reminded him of the girl she once was, full of hope and dreams, before he'd shattered them both. The following Thursday brought a discovery that would change everything Richard thought he knew. He'd positioned himself near the community center again, watching Emily interact with her students. An older woman approached Emily, speaking urgently and gesturing toward a young boy who stood apart from the group. Richard strained to hear their conversation. "Miss Emily, we don't know what to do. His mother's in the hospital again, and child services is threatening to take him. You're the only one he trusts." Emily knelt beside the boy, maybe 10 years old, and spoke softly to him. The child's tears fell freely as she pulled him into a hug. Richard's heart constricted as he watched his daughter, his brilliant, compassionate daughter, comfort this child with the same tenderness she'd once shown him. Then Emily did something that left Richard speechless. She reached into her worn purse, pulled out what appeared to be her entire week's tips from the diner, and pressed the money into the older woman's hands. "For his mother's medication," Emily said firmly. "And tell child services I'll be the emergency contact. He can stay with me if needed." Richard sat in his study that night, unable to sleep, unable to think about anything except what he'd witnessed. His daughter, who could barely afford her own rent, was offering to take in a child. His daughter, working 3 jobs, was giving away her tips to help a stranger's medical bills. His daughter, who'd lost everything because of his cruelty, was teaching underprivileged kids for free every Tuesday and Thursday. The irony wasn't lost on him. Those were the same nights he'd been too busy for her when she was growing up, always citing board meetings and business dinners. Now she'd turned those nights into something beautiful, something meaningful, while he'd wasted them building an empire that felt increasingly hollow. Marcus had discovered more in his investigation. Emily had been denied financial aid for medical school because Richard's wealth was still listed on her records, but he'd refused to help her. She'd tried to work her way through school, but when her adoptive mother, Sarah, fell ill with cancer, Emily had dropped everything to care for her. Sarah had passed away 5 years ago, leaving Emily with nothing but debt and grief. Richard had known about Sarah's death. He'd sent flowers anonymously, but he'd never imagined the toll it had taken on his daughter. On the next Tuesday, Richard's surveillance took an unexpected turn. He watched Emily leave the diner, but instead of heading to the community center, she walked toward the hospital 3 blocks away. His driver followed at a discreet distance as Emily entered through the main doors. Richard waited 15 minutes before following, his heart pounding with each step. He'd avoided hospital since his own cancer diagnosis 6 months ago, but something compelled him forward. At the reception desk, he casually inquired about volunteer programs, and the cheerful receptionist pointed him toward the pediatric ward. "Oh, you might run into our star volunteer, Emily. She's here every Tuesday night, reading to the sick children." Richard's throat tightened as he rode the elevator up, each floor bringing him closer to a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to face. When the doors opened, he heard it. Emily's voice, gentle and animated, reading a story to an unseen audience. He peered around the corner to see her surrounded by children in hospital beds, their faces lit up with joy despite their circumstances. She wasn't just reading, she was performing, giving these kids a moment of magic in their darkest hours. Richard watched from the shadows as Emily finished her story and began moving from bed to bed, speaking quietly with each child. A nurse approached her with a concerned expression. "Emily, honey, you need to go home. You've been here for 3 hours and you have the early shift at the diner tomorrow." Emily smiled, but Richard could see the exhaustion etched in her features. "Just 5 more minutes with Sarah," she said, gesturing to a small girl in the corner bed. The name made Richard freeze. Sarah, like her mother. As Emily sat beside the little girl, holding her hand and speaking in hushed tones, Richard's private investigator appeared at his elbow. "Sir, I have new information. That child, Sarah Martinez, has been here for 6 months. Terminal leukemia. No family except an aunt who can't afford treatment. The hospital bills are astronomical, and they're about to transfer her to state care." Marcus paused, consulting his notes. "Your daughter has been trying to raise money for Sarah's experimental treatment. She started 3 different fundraisers, all unsuccessful. She's even applied for loans, but her credit is too damaged. Sir, she's been selling her possessions to help cover the bills." Richard's world tilted on its axis as the pieces fell into place. The medical bills in the folder weren't for Emily. They were for this child she'd taken under her wing. The desperate financial situation, the multiple jobs, the sacrifice of her own dreams, all for a little girl who wasn't even related to her. He watched as Emily tucked the blanket around Sarah's small frame, kissing her forehead with the tenderness of a mother. The little girl whispered something that made Emily laugh, a sound Richard realized he hadn't heard in 20 years. When Emily finally left the hospital, Richard remained, staring at the child through the window. Sarah couldn't have been more than 8 years old, pale and thin from her illness, but her eyes held a spark of hope that Richard recognized. It was the same spark Emily had possessed as a child, before he'd extinguished it with his selfishness. A nurse noticed him watching and approached kindly. "Are you family? Little Sarah doesn't get many visitors except for Miss Emily. That woman is an angel. She's been here almost every day for 6 months, reading, playing, just being present. She even tried to get listed as a foster parent, but her financial situation—" The nurse trailed off, shaking her head sadly. Richard left the hospital in a daze, his mind reeling with the magnitude of what he'd discovered. His daughter, the one he'd abandoned, the one he'd financially destroyed, the one he'd treated as expendable, had become the kind of person he'd only pretended to be through his charitable foundations and tax-deductible donations. Emily's charity was real, personal, sacrificial. She gave from her poverty, while he gave from his abundance and called it generosity. That night, Richard sat in his mansion, surrounded by priceless art and empty rooms, and finally understood the true cost of his choices. He'd spent 20 years building walls around his heart, convincing himself that Emily's absence was her choice, that she'd rejected him just as he'd rejected her. But the truth was far more painful. She'd never stopped being the loving, generous soul he'd raised her to be. She'd simply learned to direct that love elsewhere, to children who needed her, to strangers who appreciated her, to a little girl named Sarah who saw in Emily what Richard had been too blind to see. A hero, a mother figure, a reason to hope. And now, as his own time ran short, Richard faced an impossible question. Could he find a way to help his daughter without revealing that he'd been watching her, judging her, secretly documenting her struggles while doing nothing to ease them? The next morning, Richard called an emergency meeting with his legal team and financial advisors. He'd spent the entire night awake, formulating a plan that was as risky as it was necessary. "I need you to set up an anonymous trust fund," he told his attorney, Michael Grayson, who'd been with him for 30 years. $5 million, accessible immediately for medical expenses related to a child named Sarah Martinez, currently at Metropolitan Hospital. Michael's pen froze mid-signature. "Richard, that's a substantial amount for someone who isn't family. May I ask—" Richard cut him off with a wave of his hand. "No questions. Make it untraceable to me. The funds should appear to come from a charitable foundation, something generic that can't be connected to Sterling Industries." As his team scrambled to execute his orders, Richard felt a mixture of relief and terror. This was just the first step in a much larger plan, one that would either restore his relationship with Emily or destroy any remaining chance of reconciliation. He was about to insert himself into her life without her knowledge, manipulating events from the shadows, like the puppet master he'd always been. But this time, he told himself, his intentions were pure. This time, he was trying to fix what he'd broken, even if she never knew it was him. 3 days later, Richard returned to his surveillance spot outside the hospital, waiting for Emily's Tuesday night visit. His heart raced as he watched her arrive, her step heavier than usual, her face etched with worry. He knew from Marcus's updates that the hospital had given Sarah only weeks to live without the experimental treatment, and that Emily had been desperately trying to raise the remaining funds. What Emily didn't know was that earlier that day, the hospital had received a mysterious donation specifically designated for Sarah Martinez's treatment. Richard watched through the hospital window as a doctor approached Emily in the pediatric ward, his expression serious. Emily's body language screamed anxiety as she stood up, clearly expecting bad news. Then something remarkable happened. The doctor's stern expression broke into a smile, and he handed Emily a folder. Even from his distant vantage point, Richard could see the exact moment Emily understood what she was reading. Her hands flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face as she collapsed into a nearby chair. The other nurses rushed to her side, and through the window, Richard could read Emily's lips, repeating the same words over and over. "Thank you, God. Thank you." She had no idea that God hadn't sent this miracle, her estranged father had. Richard began following Emily more closely, watching as the news of Sarah's funded treatment transformed her entire world. The weight lifted from her shoulders was visible in the way she walked, the way she smiled at strangers, the way she threw herself into her work with renewed energy. But what Richard didn't anticipate was how Emily would respond to this blessing. Instead of relaxing, instead of reducing her work hours, now that the financial pressure was off, Emily doubled down on her community involvement. She started a fundraising campaign for other families at the hospital, using Sarah's story as inspiration. She organized donation drives at the diner, convincing her co-workers and regular customers to contribute to pediatric cancer research. Marcus reported that she'd even reached out to local news stations, trying to find the mysterious donor who'd saved Sarah's life so she could thank them personally. Richard's chest tightened with each update. His daughter wasn't just grateful, she was inspired to pay forward the kindness she believed a stranger had shown her. She'd taken his guilty attempt at redemption and transformed it into a movement, touching dozens of lives in the process. Watching her, Richard realized something profound. Emily hadn't just survived the hardships he'd imposed on her. She'd used them to become stronger, more compassionate, more purposeful than he'd ever been. 2 weeks into Sarah's treatment, Richard made a decision that terrified him. He needed to get closer, to understand Emily's life from the inside, rather than through windows and investigator reports. He contacted the community center where Emily volunteered, posing as a wealthy donor interested in supporting their educational programs. The director, Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman with kind eyes, welcomed him warmly. "Mr. Sterling, we're honored by your interest. Our funding has been cut dramatically this year, and we're struggling to keep the doors open." Richard toured the facility, his heart breaking at the worn furniture, outdated computers, and barely stocked supply closet. This was where Emily chose to spend her free time, pouring her energy into kids who had nothing. Mrs. Patterson showed him into the classroom where Emily taught every Tuesday and Thursday. "That's where the magic happens," she said with obvious affection. "Emily is remarkable. She doesn't just tutor these kids. She mentors them, believes in them when no one else does. Half of them have gone on to graduate high school because of her. 3 have even made it to college." Richard ran his hand over one of the desks, imagining Emily sitting here, giving these children the attention and care he'd denied her. "I'd like to meet this Emily," Richard said carefully, trying to keep his voice steady. "Perhaps discuss expanding the program." Mrs. Patterson's face lit up. "She'll be here Thursday evening. But Mr. Sterling, I should warn you, Emily is fiercely protective of these kids and our mission. She's turned down donors before when she felt they wanted recognition more than results. She has strong principles about charity and integrity." Richard nearly laughed at the irony. Of course his daughter would have standards that he'd likely fail to meet. Of course she'd see through the performative philanthropy that had been his trademark for decades. "I understand," he said quietly. "I'm not looking for recognition. I just want to help." As Thursday approached, Richard's anxiety reached unbearable levels. He hadn't been in the same room as his daughter in 20 years. The last time they'd spoken, he'd told her she was no longer his responsibility, that she needed to learn to stand on her own, that his new wife deserved his financial priority. The memory of her tears, her desperate plea for him not to abandon her, haunted his dreams. Now he was about to face her again, hidden behind a fake beard, glasses, and the name Robert Stone, a disguise his security team had helped him create. The risk was enormous. If she recognized him, she might cause a scene or worse, simply walk away, ending any chance of reconciliation. Thursday evening arrived with agonizing slowness. Richard, now Robert Stone, entered the community centre at 6:30, his heart pounding so hard he feared it might give out before he even saw Emily. Mrs. Patterson greeted him warmly and led him to the classroom, where teenagers were already gathering for the evening session. "Emily should be here any minute. She's always exactly on time." Richard positioned himself in the corner, trying to appear casual while every nerve in his body screamed with anticipation. Then she walked through the door, and time seemed to stop. Emily looked tired from her diner shift, her uniform still on, but her face glowed with genuine joy as her students surrounded her with excited chatter. "Miss Emily! Miss Emily! I got an A on my math test!" a young girl exclaimed. Emily's laugh, that beautiful sound Richard had missed for 2 decades, filled the room. "Jasmine, I knew you could do it. See what happens when you believe in yourself." She hugged the girl, then moved through the room, greeting each student by name, asking about their days, their families, their struggles. Richard watched, mesmerized, as his daughter commanded the room with warmth and authority. Exactly the kind of leader he'd tried to teach her to be in business, but she'd translated it into something far more meaningful. Mrs. Patterson interrupted the class to introduce Mr. Stone, and Richard felt Emily's eyes land on him for the first time in 20 years. His breath caught in his throat as she studied him with mild curiosity, no recognition flickering in her expression. The fake beard and glasses were working. "Mr. Stone is considering supporting our program," Mrs. Patterson explained. Emily approached him with a polite smile, extending her hand. "It's nice to meet you, Mr. Stone. I hope Mrs. Patterson has told you about the amazing kids we work with here." Her hand was warm in his, and Richard had to fight back tears at this simple touch. "She has," he managed, his voice slightly altered by the voice modulator he'd been practicing with. "I'm very impressed by what you've built here. Mrs. Patterson tells me you volunteer your time, that you're not paid for this work." Emily shrugged, releasing his hand and turning to set up the whiteboard for the evening's lesson. "Money isn't why I do this. These kids remind me of myself, talented, motivated, but without the resources or support system to reach their potential. If I can be that support for even one of them, it's worth every minute." Richard's throat tightened. She had no idea she was describing exactly what he'd failed to be for her. Richard asked if he could observe the class, and Emily agreed with a slight wariness in her eyes. "Of course, but please don't disrupt the learning environment. These kids have enough distractions in their lives." He sat in the back row, watching his daughter teach with a skill that left him in awe. She explained complex algebra concepts in simple terms, using real-world examples that resonated with her students' experiences. When a boy struggled with a problem, she didn't give him the answer. She guided him through the logic until he reached the solution himself. "See, Marcus," she said to the boy, ironically, the same name as Richard's investigator. "You didn't need me to solve it. You just needed to trust your own intelligence. That's the lesson here. You're smarter than you think you are." The boy beamed with pride, and Richard realized this was Emily's true gift. She wasn't just teaching math. She was teaching self-worth, resilience, hope. She was giving these kids what he'd taken from her, the confidence to believe in themselves. As the class progressed, Richard noticed Emily favoring her left leg slightly, a subtle limp she tried to hide. When she reached for a book on a high shelf, he saw her wince. Something was wrong, something physical, and it added another layer of concern to his already overwhelming guilt. After class, as students filed out with homework assignments and words of encouragement, Richard approached Emily with Mrs. Patterson. "That was extraordinary," he said honestly. "You have a real gift for connecting with these young people." Emily smiled, but her eyes remained cautious. "Thank you, Mr. Stone. So, what kind of support are you considering for the program?" Richard had prepared for this question, but hearing it directly from his daughter made his rehearsed speech vanish. I'd like to fund whatever you need. New computers, books, supplies, even stipends for the students who are struggling financially. And perhaps a salary for you, so you could expand the program. Emily's expression immediately shifted from polite interest to cool skepticism. That's very generous, but I need to understand your motivation. In my experience, wealthy donors often have strings attached to their generosity. What do you want in return? Press coverage? A building named after you? Tax benefits? Richard felt the words like physical blows, even though they were entirely justified. Nothing, he said quietly. I want nothing except to know that these kids have the opportunities they deserve, and that you, the teachers like you, are supported in this crucial work. Emily studied him for a long moment, her intelligent eyes searching his face for deception. For a terrifying second, Richard thought she might see through his disguise, might recognize something essential about him despite the physical changes. I've learned to be suspicious of easy money, Mr. Stone, Emily finally said, her voice carrying a weight of experience that broke Richard's heart. The people who promise the most usually deliver the least, but more importantly, they tend to want control over curriculum, over who we serve, over the mission itself. This program exists to help kids who've been overlooked and abandoned by the system. I won't compromise that for any amount of funding. Richard heard the deeper meaning in her words. She was talking about more than just the program. She was talking about her own experience of being abandoned, of promises broken, of trust shattered. I understand your caution, he said carefully. What if we started small? Let me fund one specific need, something the kids desperately require, with no strings attached. If I prove trustworthy, we can discuss larger support later. Emily considered this, glancing at Mrs. Patterson, who nodded encouragingly. Fine. We need new laptops for the computer literacy program. Ours are 10 years old and barely functional. 15 laptops, decent quality, nothing fancy. If you can deliver that without conditions, we'll talk about next steps. Richard wanted to promise her the world, wanted to write a check that would solve every problem she faced, but he forced himself to stick to the plan. I'll have them delivered by next week, he said simply. As he left the community center, Richard realized the full magnitude of his challenge. His daughter had learned to protect herself, to trust cautiously, to question generosity, and he was the one who taught her those hard lessons. True to his word, Richard had 15 state-of-the-art laptops delivered to the community center within 3 days. He didn't just send generic computers. He researched educational software and had each laptop preloaded with programs specifically designed for underprivileged students, math tutorials, college prep resources, coding lessons, and creative writing tools. He included a 3-year warranty and tech support, but made sure everything was invoiced under Robert Stone through a shell company that couldn't be traced back to Sterling Industries. When Marcus reported that the laptops had been delivered, Richard returned to the community center, unable to resist seeing Emily's reaction. He arrived just as she was unboxing the equipment with her students, and the pure joy on their faces made every risk worthwhile. "Miss Emily, these are incredible," one teenager exclaimed, powering up a laptop with reverent care. "These are better than the computers at school." Emily examined the machines with a mixture of gratitude and lingering suspicion. When she noticed Richard standing in the doorway, she approached him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Mr. Stone, these are far beyond what I expected. They must have cost a fortune." "Every child deserves quality tools for learning," Richard replied, echoing words he'd once said to Emily when she was young, back when he still believed his own rhetoric. Emily's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a heart-stopping moment, Richard thought she'd recognize the phrase. That's a nice sentiment," she said slowly. "My father used to say something similar back when I thought he meant it." The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable, and Richard felt each word like a knife to his chest. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that he had meant it, that he'd lost his way, but was trying to find it again. Instead, he simply nodded. Perhaps he did mean it at the time. People sometimes forget their values when they're tested. Emily laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Or perhaps some people never had real values to begin with. They just had convenient philosophies that they abandoned the moment those philosophies became inconvenient. She turned back to her students, dismissing him, but Richard caught the pain beneath her anger. After 20 years, his betrayal still cut deep, still shaped how she viewed the world and the people in it. He'd done more than hurt her. He'd damaged her ability to trust, to believe in the goodness of others. Over the following weeks, Richard became a regular presence at the community centre, always as Robert Stone, always keeping his distance while finding ways to help. He funded field trips to museums and colleges, established a scholarship fund for Emily's students, and quietly paid for supplies that the centre couldn't afford. Each interaction with Emily revealed more layers to her character, her sharp intelligence, her dry humor, her unwavering commitment to her students, and her deep wounds from the past. One Thursday evening, Richard arrived to find Emily in Mrs. Patterson's office, clearly in the middle of a difficult conversation. Through the partially open door, he heard Mrs. Patterson say, "Emily, you need to see a doctor about that leg. It's getting worse, and I've seen you taking painkillers before every class." Emily's response was firm. "I can't afford physical therapy right now, and it's not serious enough for the emergency room. I'll be fine." Richard's blood ran cold. This was new information that Marcus hadn't uncovered. He waited until Emily left the office, then casually asked Mrs. Patterson about the situation. The elderly director sighed heavily. "She injured it 6 months ago, lifting something at the diner. A workplace accident. But of course, that establishment doesn't provide health insurance or workers' compensation. She's been in chronic pain ever since, but she refuses to cut back on her hours because of little Sarah's treatment costs." Richard felt rage building inside him. Rage at the diner that exploited his daughter. Rage at a healthcare system that forced people to choose between financial ruin and physical suffering. But mostly rage at himself for creating the circumstances that had led Emily to this point. That night, he instructed Marcus to investigate the diner's ownership and labor practices. "I want to know everything," Richard growled into the phone. "Every violation, every shortcut, every instance of employee exploitation. And I want to know who owns the building Emily lives in, what her lease terms are, everything about her financial situation." Marcus hesitated. "Sir, with respect, you're getting very involved here. If Emily discovers you've been investigating her life, manipulating her circumstances—" Richard cut him off. "She won't discover it. I'll make sure of that. Just get me the information." But even as he said it, Richard knew he was walking a dangerous line. He was essentially stalking his own daughter, invading her privacy under the guise of helping her. The ethics were murky at best, criminal at worst. Yet every time doubt crept in, he remembered Emily wincing as she stood for 2 hours teaching algebra, remembered her giving away her tip money, remembered the little girl in the hospital bed who would have died without his intervention. He was doing good, he told himself. The ends justified the means. The following Tuesday, Richard visited Sarah at the hospital, this time without his disguise. He'd told the nurses he was a representative from the anonymous charitable foundation that had funded her treatment, which was technically true. Little Sarah was awake, looking much healthier than she had weeks ago, her color improved by the experimental therapy. "Are you the angel who saved me?" she asked in a small voice. Richard's throat constricted. "No, sweetheart. I'm just someone who wanted to help," Sarah smiled. "Miss Emily says you're an angel. She prays for you every night, thanking God for sending you to save me. She says you're proof that miracles are real." Richard had to turn away, overwhelmed by emotions he'd suppressed for decades. His daughter was praying for him, thanking God for his intervention, while simultaneously carrying deep wounds from his abandonment. The contradiction was almost too much to bear. He sat beside Sarah's bed, and she chattered away about Emily, about how wonderful she was, how she read stories and brought coloring books and never missed a visit. "Miss Emily is going to adopt me when I'm better," Sarah said with absolute confidence. She promised. She said every little girl deserves a family who loves her, and she's going to be my new mommy. Richard's heart stopped. Emily was planning to adopt Sarah. The medical bills, the foster care application Marcus had mentioned, the sacrifice of her time and resources, it all made sense now. His daughter, who could barely support herself, was trying to become a mother to a terminally ill child. The sheer audacity and compassion of it left him breathless. He gently questioned Sarah about Emily's plans, and the little girl revealed everything with the unfiltered honesty of childhood. Emily had been working with a social worker, trying to get approved as a foster parent and eventually adoptive parent. The main obstacle was her financial situation. Child services required proof of stable income and adequate housing, neither of which Emily could currently demonstrate. "But Miss Emily says love is more important than money," Sarah said firmly. "She says we'll figure it out together." After leaving the hospital, Richard sat in his car for an hour, his mind racing through possibilities. He could anonymously pay off Emily's debts, improve her credit score, even arrange for a better job offer, all things that would help her adoption case. But each intervention carried risks of discovery, and more importantly, questions about whether he had the right to manipulate her life, even with good intentions. His phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. "Found something about the diner. Major health code violations and wage theft documented. Owner is facing potential lawsuits." Richard made a decision that would change everything. He instructed his legal team to anonymously report the diner's violations to the Labor Board and Health Department, ensuring a thorough investigation. Within a week, the diner was shut down pending corrections, and all employees were given settlement payments for back wages and damages. Emily received a check for $12,000, money she was legally owed for years of overtime and minimum wage violations. Richard watched from across the street as Emily stood outside the closed diner, holding the settlement check with tears streaming down her face. He saw her pull out her phone and make a call, her expression transforming from shock to joy. Later, Marcus reported that Emily had immediately contacted the social worker handling Sarah's case, informing her of the improved financial situation. But the closure of the diner meant Emily had lost one of her 3 jobs, and despite the settlement money, she'd need new employment quickly to maintain the steady income required for adoption approval. Richard had solved one problem, but created another. That night, he lay awake in his mansion, staring at the ceiling, realizing that playing God with his daughter's life was far more complicated than he'd imagined. Every action had unintended consequences. Every solution revealed new problems. The next Thursday, Richard arrived at the community center to find Emily in an animated discussion with Mrs. Patterson. "I can't accept this," Emily was saying, waving a piece of paper. "It's too much, too convenient, too—" Mrs. Patterson interrupted gently. "Emily, honey, the center needs a full-time program director. You're the obvious choice. You've been doing the work already. This would just make it official and paid. The grant that came through specifically designated funds for a director position. This isn't charity, it's recognition of your value." Richard's pulse quickened. He hadn't arranged for this, at least not directly. He'd made an anonymous donation to the center's parent organization, but he hadn't specified how the funds should be used. Apparently, Mrs. Patterson had taken the initiative to create the position for Emily. Emily noticed Richard standing in the doorway. "Mr. Stone, did you have anything to do with this?" Her eyes bore into him with laser focus, and Richard felt the full weight of her suspicion. "The grant came from a different foundation," he said carefully, which was technically true. "But if Mrs. Patterson believes you're the right person for the position, I'm sure it's well deserved." Emily studied him for a long moment, clearly unconvinced. "Things don't just work out this perfectly, Mr. Stone, not in my experience. The diner closes, but I get settlement money. I need steady employment, and suddenly a dream job appears. It feels orchestrated." Richard's heart raced as he realized how intelligent his daughter truly was. She was connecting dots he'd tried to keep separated, seeing patterns he'd attempted to hide. He needed to deflect without lying outright. "Perhaps you're experiencing what people call karma," he suggested, keeping his voice neutral. "You've spent years helping others selflessly. Maybe the universe is finally helping you in return." Emily laughed bitterly. "I stopped believing in cosmic justice a long time ago, Mr. Stone. Around the same time I stopped believing in fairy tales and unconditional love. The universe doesn't care about what's fair. People with power decide what happens to people without it." Her words cut straight through Richard's carefully constructed defenses. She was describing exactly what he'd done to her, used his power to decide her fate, to punish her for not accepting his new wife, to withdraw his support when she needed it most. "I'm sorry that's been your experience," he said quietly, meaning it with every fiber of his being. "But perhaps this could be a turning point, a chance to build the life you deserve." Emily's expression softened slightly, vulnerability flickering across her features. "I want to believe that, Mr. Stone. I really do. But I've learned that when things seem too good to be true, they usually are. Someone always wants something in return." That evening, after Emily accepted the program director position with cautious optimism, Richard sat in his study reviewing Marcus's latest report. Emily's adoption application was progressing, her improved financial situation making her a much stronger candidate. Sarah's treatment was showing remarkable results. Doctors were now using the word remission instead of terminal. The community center was thriving with the new funding, serving twice as many students. By every measurable metric, Richard's interventions were succeeding. Yet he felt increasingly hollow, increasingly aware that he was building his redemption on a foundation of deception. Emily didn't know that her mysterious benefactor and Robert Stone were different people. She didn't know that her estranged father was orchestrating her life from the shadows. She didn't know that every miracle she'd experienced in recent months was carefully manufactured by the man she'd once loved and now presumably hated. Richard's doctor had called earlier that day with updated test results. The cancer was progressing faster than expected. He had perhaps 6 months left, maybe less. Time was running out to reveal the truth, to ask for forgiveness, to explain why he'd abandoned her and why he was now trying desperately to make amends. But with each passing day, the web of lies grew more complex, and the potential for devastating Emily when she learned the truth grew exponentially. Richard was trapped in a prison of his own making, unable to move forward with honesty or backward to simpler deceptions. 3 weeks into Emily's new position as program director, Richard began experiencing severe health complications. He collapsed during a board meeting, and his personal physician insisted on immediate hospitalization. As Richard lay in a private suite at Metropolitan Hospital, ironically the same hospital where Sarah was being treated, he realized the bitter irony of his situation. He was dying in luxury, surrounded by the best medical care money could buy, while just floors below, his daughter visited a little girl who'd nearly died from lack of those same resources. Marcus visited him daily, bringing updates about Emily that were both heartwarming and heartbreaking. She was thriving in her new role, expanding the center's programs and helping even more students. She'd been approved as Sarah's foster parent, with adoption proceedings scheduled to begin once Sarah was officially in remission. She'd moved into a better apartment, finally able to afford a 2-bedroom place where Sarah would have her own room. Everything Richard had orchestrated was falling perfectly into place, except for one critical detail. He was running out of time to tell her the truth. His oncologist had revised the timeline again, weeks, not months. Richard stared at the ceiling of his hospital room, machines beeping around him, and faced the terrifying possibility that he might die without ever revealing himself to his daughter. Emily, unaware that her father lay dying floors above, continued her Tuesday and Thursday visits to Sarah. Richard, unable to resist, had Marcus wheel him to a location where he could watch their interactions through a window. Sarah was being discharged soon, healthy enough to begin her new life with Emily, and the excitement between them was palpable. Richard watched as Emily showed Sarah photos of their new apartment on her phone, pointing out the bedroom she decorated specifically for the little girl. "And this is your bookshelf," Emily explained, zooming in on the image. "I filled it with all the stories we've read together, plus new ones for us to discover." Sarah hugged Emily tightly, and Richard saw his daughter's face transform with maternal love, the same expression Sarah, Emily's adoptive mother, had worn when she'd first brought Emily home 20 years ago. Richard had been married to Sarah briefly, and Emily had been their adopted daughter together. When Sarah and Richard divorced, Sarah had kept Emily, loving her fiercely until her death from cancer. Richard had abandoned them both, choosing his career and eventually his second wife over his family. Now, Emily was recreating that bond with another child, giving Sarah Martinez the love and security that Richard had failed to provide. The poetry of it, two Sarahs, both saved by Emily's fierce devotion, was almost too much to bear. Richard's condition deteriorated rapidly over the next week. His doctors informed him that he had days, perhaps 2 weeks at most, before organ failure would take him. He'd already arranged his will, leaving the vast majority of his fortune to Emily and establishing trust funds for Sarah Martinez and the community center. But the legal documents felt hollow, cowardly, a way to absolve his guilt without facing the consequences of his actions. He called Marcus to his bedside. "I need to tell her," Richard said, his voice weak. "I need Emily to know the truth before I die. Arrange a meeting. Tell her Robert Stone is gravely ill and needs to speak with her urgently." Marcus looked uncomfortable. "Sir, with respect, revealing everything now might do more harm than good. She's finally happy, finally stable. Learning that you've been manipulating her life for months, that every good thing that's happened was orchestrated by the father who abandoned her, it could destroy the progress she's made." Richard closed his eyes, knowing Marcus was right but unable to accept it. "She deserves to know. She deserves the choice of whether to forgive me or curse my name. I won't die hiding behind a fake identity and manufactured miracles. Set up the meeting." Marcus reluctantly agreed, but Richard could see the concern in his eyes. Emily arrived at the hospital 2 days later, having been told that Robert Stone had been hospitalized and wished to see her. Richard watched through a crack in his door as she approached, her expression concerned but guarded. She wore a simple dress, probably her best outfit, worn out of respect for the man she believed had helped her students. Richard's heart ached, seeing her prepare herself to comfort a stranger while her actual father lay dying behind a disguise she was about to see through. Marcus had arranged for Richard to be in a private consultation room rather than his hospital suite, giving him a chance to control the environment for the revelation. When Emily entered, Richard was seated in a chair, his fake beard and glasses removed, his gaunt face exposed by illness. For a moment, Emily didn't recognize him. 20 years and cancer had changed his appearance dramatically. Then her eyes locked onto his, and Richard saw the exact moment recognition hit. The color drained from her face, her body went rigid, and her expression cycled rapidly through shock, disbelief, and finally, blazing anger. "You!" she whispered, the single word carrying 20 years of pain, betrayal, and rage. "It was you! All of it! Robert Stone, the donations, Sarah's treatment, the job, everything." Richard nodded, unable to speak around the lump in his throat. Emily's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her whole body trembling with barely controlled fury. "How dare you?" she said, her voice low and dangerous. "How dare you insert yourself into my life after 20 years? How dare you manipulate me, lie to me, play God with my circumstances while hiding behind a fake name and a disguise?" Richard tried to speak, but Emily cut him off with a sharp gesture. "No, you don't get to talk yet. You threw me away like garbage when your new wife decided she didn't want a stepdaughter. You cut me off completely, left me to struggle through medical school alone, refused to help when Sarah, was dying of cancer. You didn't come to her funeral. You didn't check if I was okay. You disappeared and let me believe you didn't care if I lived or died." Tears streamed down her face now, years of suppressed pain pouring out. And now that you're dying, because that's why you're here, isn't it? You're dying and you want absolution. You suddenly decide to be my mysterious benefactor. You think you can buy forgiveness with anonymous donations and manufactured miracles? Richard felt each accusation like a physical blow, but he forced himself to listen, to absorb the full weight of what he'd done to her. "Emily, please," Richard finally managed, his voice breaking. "You're right, about all of it. I was a coward. I'm a coward. I chose my pride and my failing marriage over you, and I've regretted it every single day for 20 years. Emily laughed bitterly. "Oh, you've regretted it. You've felt bad. Poor you, suffering in your mansion with your billions while I worked 3 jobs just to survive." Richard pressed forward, knowing this might be his only chance. "6 months ago, I was diagnosed with terminal cancer. I knew I was dying, and I couldn't face death without knowing if you were okay, without trying to fix the damage I'd caused. So I hired an investigator. I started following you, and what I saw," his voice cracked with emotion, "what I saw humbled me completely. You had every reason to become bitter, selfish, cynical. Instead, you became the most compassionate, selfless person I've ever known. You were struggling to survive, yet you gave everything to help others. You worked yourself to exhaustion to save a little girl who wasn't even related to you. You embodied every value I'd claimed to have, but never actually lived." Emily's expression wavered, anger mixing with confusion and pain. "So, this was what? An experiment? You wanted to see if your abandoned daughter turned out okay?" "No," Richard said urgently, leaning forward despite the pain it caused. "It started as surveillance, yes, but it became something else. I saw you struggling because of my choices, because I'd destroyed your credit and your support system. I saw you in pain from an injury you couldn't afford to treat, working multiple jobs to save a child's life while I had billions sitting unused in accounts. How could I watch you suffer when I had the power to help? How could I let Sarah die when a fraction of my wealth could save her?" Emily's eyes narrowed. "So you decided to play puppet master, to manipulate my entire life without my knowledge or consent. You don't see how that's just another form of control, another way of making decisions for me instead of trusting me to make them myself." Richard hadn't considered it that way, but hearing Emily articulate it, he realized she was absolutely right. He'd claimed to be helping her, but really, he'd been satisfying his own need for redemption, his own desire to feel like a good person before death. He'd never asked what Emily wanted. He'd simply imposed his vision of what she needed. "You're right," he admitted quietly. "I did it again. I made decisions about your life without considering your agency, your right to choose. I'm sorry, Emily. I'm so deeply sorry." The apology hung in the air between them, inadequate for the magnitude of his betrayals, but sincere in a way Richard had never been before. Emily sank into a chair across from him, her anger giving way to exhaustion. "Why now? Why not 10 years ago or 15? Why did it take you dying to care about whether I was okay?" Richard had asked himself the same question countless times. "Cowardice," he said simply. Every year that passed made it harder to reach out, harder to admit how wrong I'd been. I told myself you were better off without me, that you'd moved on and forgotten about me. I built a wall of justifications around my guilt until I could almost pretend I hadn't done anything wrong. Udi, he paused, gathering strength. The cancer diagnosis shattered that wall. Suddenly, I was facing my own mortality, and I couldn't hide any more from the truth. That abandoning you was the worst thing I'd ever done. That every success I'd achieved meant nothing because I'd failed at the only thing that truly mattered, being your father. Emily wiped her tears, her expression impossible to read. "What do you want from me? Forgiveness? Some deathbed reconciliation scene where I hold your hand and tell you everything's okay?" Richard shook his head. "I want nothing. I deserve nothing. I just needed you to know the truth, that I never stopped loving you, even when I acted like I didn't, that I'm proud of the person you've become, despite my failures, and that everything I did, All the anonymous help came from genuine desire to ease your burdens, even if my methods were wrong." Emily stood abruptly, pacing the small room like a caged animal. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to drop this bomb on me and then die, leaving me to sort through the wreckage. I finally got my life together. I have a job I love, a daughter I'm about to adopt, stability for the first time in years, and now I find out it's all built on lies, that my mysterious benefactor was actually my estranged father playing games." Richard felt panic rising. He'd known this would be difficult, but he hadn't fully anticipated how violated Emily would feel. "It's not built on lies," he tried to argue. "Your success, your new position, you earned those. I just removed some obstacles. Sarah's treatment, the laptops, the job opportunity, those were gifts, not manipulations." Emily whirled on him. "Gifts require consent. You can't force help on someone and call it generosity. Every decision I made in the past 3 months was based on false information. I thought the universe was finally rewarding my hard work. I thought God had sent an angel to save Sarah. I rebuilt my faith in humanity, in divine justice, in the possibility of good things happening to good people. And it was all you, manipulating events from behind the scenes." She laughed harshly. "Do you know what the worst part is? I can't even be purely angry because you did save Sarah's life. That little girl would be dead without your money. How am I supposed to hate you for that?" The question hung between them, unanswerable and devastating. Richard realized with sudden clarity that his attempt at redemption had created an impossible situation for Emily. She was trapped between justified anger at his betrayal and gratitude for his help, unable to fully embrace either emotion. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I don't know how you're supposed to feel or what the right response is. I only know that I had to tell you the truth before I died, even if it hurt you, because living with the deception felt like another betrayal." Emily stopped pacing, staring at him with an expression that broke his heart. It was the same look she'd given him 20 years ago when he'd told her she was no longer his financial responsibility. It was a look of profound disappointment, of a child realizing her parent wasn't the hero she'd believed in. "How long?" she asked quietly. "How long do you have?" Richard consulted the timeline his doctors had given him. 2 weeks, maybe less. "The cancer has spread too far for treatment. I'm here for pain management and end-of-life care." Emily nodded slowly, processing this information. When she spoke again, her voice was carefully controlled, emotionless. "I need time. I need to think about all of this, to figure out how I feel without you dying in front of me and pressuring me to forgive you. Can you give me that? Can you let me have space to process this revelation?" Richard wanted to beg her to stay, to keep talking, to give him something, anything that felt like connection before he died. But he'd taken enough from her. If she needed space, he owed her that. "Of course," he said softly. "Take all the time you need." Emily left without another word, and Richard watched her go with the crushing certainty that he might never see her again. The days that followed were the longest of his life. He remained in the hospital, his condition declining steadily, while Marcus provided updates about Emily that only deepened his despair. She'd taken a few days off from work, telling Mrs. Patterson she needed personal time. She'd continued visiting Sarah, but had told the little girl nothing about the revelation, maintaining normalcy for the child's sake. She hadn't contacted Richard, hadn't sent word through Marcus, had given no indication of her feelings or decisions. Richard understood. She owed him nothing, not even closure, but the waiting was torture. He'd faced corporate battles, survived market crashes, negotiated billion-dollar deals without flinching, but the silence from his daughter unmade him completely. On the 5th day, a nurse brought him a letter. His hand shook as he recognized Emily's handwriting on the envelope. Inside was a single page, her words carefully chosen, each sentence carrying the weight of 20 years of complicated emotions. Richard read it 3 times, tears streaming down his face, before he fully understood what she was offering him. The letter read, I've spent 5 days trying to sort through my feelings about you, about what you did, about what it all means. I've been angry, grateful, confused, betrayed, and a dozen other emotions I don't have names for. I talked to my therapist, to Mrs. Patterson, to Sarah's doctors. I even prayed, though I'm not sure who I was praying to or what I was asking for. Here's what I've realized. You were a terrible father when it mattered most. You abandoned me when I was vulnerable, chose your pride over my well-being, and left me to struggle alone through some of the darkest periods of my life. Nothing you do now can change that history or erase that pain. But you also saved Sarah's life. You helped dozens of kids through the community center. You gave me opportunities I wouldn't have had otherwise, even if your methods were manipulative and wrong. I can't reconcile these two versions of you. The man who destroyed me and the man who's trying to save me. Maybe I'm not supposed to. Maybe people are just complicated, capable of both tremendous harm and tremendous good. So here's what I'm offering. I'll come visit you. Not because you've earned forgiveness, but because I don't want to carry regret about things left unsaid. We'll talk. I'll listen. And when you die, I'll mourn, not for the father you were, but for the father you could have been. That's the best I can do right now. Emily. Richard clutched the letter to his chest, overwhelmed by emotions he couldn't name. Emily was coming. She was giving him a chance he didn't deserve, offering grace he hadn't earned. It wasn't forgiveness. She'd been clear about that. But it was something, and something was infinitely more than he'd dared to hope for. 2 days later, Emily appeared in his hospital room doorway. She looked exhausted, as though the emotional turmoil of the past week had aged her. Richard struggled to sit up, suddenly aware of how he must look. Gaunt, pale, barely recognizable as the powerful businessman he'd once been. "Don't," Emily said, moving to adjust his bed electronically. "Save your strength." The gesture was clinical, not affectionate, but Richard found comfort in it anyway. She pulled a chair beside his bed, maintaining physical distance, even as she closed the emotional gap between them. "I have questions," she said without preamble, "and I need honest answers. No more lies, no more manipulation, no more Robert Stone. Can you do that?" Richard nodded emphatically. "Yes, anything you want to know. Complete honesty. I promise." Emily studied him for a moment, as if evaluating his sincerity, then began her interrogation. "Why did you really cut me off 20 years ago?" Emily asked, her voice steady, but her hands clenched in her lap. "I've spent 2 decades trying to understand. Was it really just about your new wife not wanting me around?" Richard took a deep breath, knowing this answer would hurt them both. "Partly. Catherine, my second wife, did feel threatened by you, by my relationship with you and Sarah. She wanted to be my priority, my only family, but that's not the whole truth." He paused, gathering courage. "The real reason was fear. You were becoming your own person, making choices I didn't agree with. You wanted to study medicine instead of business. You were questioning my ethics, my business practices. You'd started pointing out the gap between my public philanthropy and my private behavior. You made me uncomfortable, forced me to see myself honestly, and I hated it." Emily's eyes widened slightly, surprised by his candor. "So you abandoned me because I challenged you, because I wouldn't be the obedient daughter who worshipped her powerful father?" Richard nodded miserably. "Yes. I was arrogant and insecure, a toxic combination. When Catherine gave me an ultimatum, I took it as an excuse to create distance. I convinced myself you'd be fine, that you were strong enough to handle anything. But really, I was just relieved to escape your judgment." Emily absorbed this confession in silence, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "Do you know what the worst part was? It wasn't the financial struggle, though that was brutal. It wasn't even being alone when Mom died, though that nearly broke me. The worst part was believing I wasn't lovable. You taught me that love was conditional, that even a parent's love could be withdrawn if you weren't perfect enough, compliant enough, convenient enough." Richard felt tears streaming down his face. "Emily, no. You were always lovable. You are lovable. My failure to love you properly was never about you. It was always about my own brokenness, my inability to love anyone more than I loved my own comfort and image. Emily wiped her own tears angrily. I know that intellectually now, after years of therapy, but that wounded little girl inside me still believes she wasn't enough. Do you understand what you did? You didn't just cut me off financially. You damaged my ability to trust, to form relationships, to believe in my own worth. I sabotaged romantic relationships for years because I was sure they'd eventually leave like you did. I overworked myself to exhaustion, trying to prove I was valuable, worthy of love and attention. Richard wanted to comfort her, to reach out and hold her hand, but he sensed she needed distance to say what she needed to say. When I decided to foster and eventually adopt Sarah, Emily continued, part of me was terrified. What if I damaged her the way you damaged me? What if I'm carrying wounds I haven't healed, trauma I'll pass on to an innocent child? Her voice broke. I've been in therapy specifically addressing this, trying to break the cycle, to become the parent I needed and never had. And then you show up, inserting yourself into my life again, and suddenly I'm questioning everything. Am I a good mother to Sarah because I'm genuinely healed, or am I overcompensating for my own childhood? Am I being selfless, or am I trying to save a little girl named Sarah because I couldn't save the Sarah who raised me, my adoptive mother, your ex-wife? Richard hadn't considered the psychological complexity of Emily's decision to adopt, especially a child with the same name as her deceased mother. I think, he said carefully, that you're being the parent you needed because you remember what it felt like to need one. That's not overcompensation, that's empathy and growth. You're breaking the cycle, not perpetuating it. Emily looked at him with an expression that contained multitudes, pain, skepticism, hope, and something that might have been the beginning of forgiveness. Tell me about watching me, she said, shifting topics. How long were you following me before you intervened? Richard explained everything, the 3 months of surveillance, the private investigator, the night sitting in his car watching her apartment, the disguise, the manufactured identity of Robert Stone. With each revelation, he watched Emily's face cycle through emotions, but she remained quiet, letting him confess it all. I know how it sounds, Richard said. I know it was invasive, possibly illegal, definitely unethical. But Emily, I was desperate. I'd wasted 20 years, and I was dying. I needed to know you were okay, and I was too much of a coward to just knock on your door and face you directly. Emily surprised him by laughing, though there was no humor in it. You spent months watching me struggle, documenting my hardships, and only then decided to help. Why not intervene immediately? Why watch me suffer at all? It was a fair question, one Richard had asked himself repeatedly. Honestly, I was gathering data, trying to understand your life before I acted. But also I was a coward. Each day I delayed was another day I didn't have to risk rejection. You manipulated my entire reality, Emily said, her voice gaining strength. The diner closing, the settlement money, the job at the community center, Sarah's treatment, all of it orchestrated by you. How am I supposed to trust my judgment now? How do I know which opportunities are real and which are manufactured by my billionaire father playing puppet master? Richard hadn't fully considered this aspect, how his interventions had undermined Emily's sense of agency and reality. The opportunities were real, he tried to explain. The diner was genuinely exploiting workers. I just ensured they faced consequences. The community center really did receive a grant. I just made sure it was substantial enough to create your position. Sarah's treatment was real medicine from real doctors. I just funded it. I didn't create fake scenarios. I amplified real opportunities and removed genuine obstacles. Emily shook her head. You don't see the problem. You're still thinking like a billionaire who can shape reality through money. You removed my agency, my chance to overcome obstacles on my own terms. Maybe I would have found another way to save Sarah. Maybe I would have built the community center program differently. You'll never know, and neither will I, because you decided you knew better." Richard realized she was absolutely right. He'd robbed her of the satisfaction of her own achievements by making everything easier without her knowledge. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of 20 years and countless mistakes hanging between them. Finally, Emily spoke again, her voice softer. "Despite everything, the manipulation, the lies, the years of abandonment, I need to say something." Richard held his breath, uncertain what was coming. "Thank you for saving Sarah. Whatever your motives, however wrong your methods, that little girl is alive because of you. She's going to grow up, have a life, maybe even a family of her own someday. That matters more than my hurt feelings or your guilt. So thank you." Richard's throat constricted with emotion. "She's lucky to have you as a mother. You're going to give her the childhood I failed to give you, filled with unconditional love, stability, and the security of knowing she's valued." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "I'm terrified I'll fail her the way you failed me." Richard shook his head emphatically. "You won't. You already proved that by putting her needs above everything else, by sacrificing your own comfort and security for her well-being. That's what real love looks like, and I never showed you that. You learned it despite me, not because of me." Emily wiped her tears. "Mum, adoptive Sarah, taught me that. She loved me unconditionally when you couldn't. She stayed when you left. Whatever capacity for love I have, I learned from her." Richard nodded, feeling the full weight of what he'd lost. Sarah was always the better person, the better parent. I was lucky to have her, and I threw that away too. Seems to be my pattern, destroying the good things in my life through arrogance and selfishness. Emily stood, preparing to leave, but paused at the door. "I'll come back," she said quietly. "Not every day, but I'll visit. I'll bring Sarah, the little one, so you can meet the child you saved. And maybe before you die, we can find some kind of peace with each other. Not forgiveness necessarily, but peace. An acknowledgement that you were terrible and you tried to make amends, and that I'm still hurt, but I'm also grateful. Maybe that's enough." Richard's heart swelled with an emotion he couldn't name. It wasn't happiness exactly, but it was something like hope. "That would be more than I deserve. Thank you, Emily, for giving me this chance, for your honesty, for still having the capacity for compassion after everything I did to you. You're an extraordinary person, and I'm proud to be your father, even if I never earned that title." Emily nodded once, then left, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts, his regrets, and the precious gift of limited time to build something resembling a relationship with the daughter he'd nearly lost forever. 3 days passed before Emily returned, and when she did, she brought Sarah Martinez with her. Richard's heart stopped when the little girl walked into his hospital room, her hand firmly clasped in Emily's. Sarah looked healthier than he'd ever seen her, color in her cheeks, brightness in her eyes, hair beginning to grow back from the chemotherapy. She wore a pink dress that Emily had clearly bought for the occasion, and she carried a handmade card decorated with crayon drawings. "Mr. Angel," Sarah said shyly, approaching Richard's bed, "Miss Emily says you're the one who saved my life. I made you a thank you card." Richard accepted the card with trembling hands, his vision blurring as he looked at the childish drawing, a stick figure of himself with wings, holding hands with stick figures labeled Sarah and Miss Emily, all surrounded by hearts. "This is beautiful, sweetheart," Richard managed, his voice breaking. "But I'm no angel. I'm just a man who wanted to help." Sarah climbed onto the chair beside his bed with the fearlessness of childhood. "Miss Emily says angels are just regular people who do good things when nobody's watching. That's you." Richard glanced at Emily, who stood by the door watching the interaction with an unreadable expression. Over the next hour, Sarah chatted away to Richard, telling him about her new room, her stuffed animal collection, the school she'd be starting once she was fully recovered. Richard listened, enchanted by her innocence, her resilience, her absolute faith that the world was good because the people in her life were good. This child had faced death, had suffered unimaginable pain, yet she radiated joy and hope. Emily had done that, had given Sarah a reason to believe in happy endings. When Sarah needed to use the bathroom, Emily accompanied her, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts. The little girl's unconditional gratitude stood in stark contrast to Emily's cautious, complicated feelings, and Richard understood why. Sarah didn't know his history, didn't understand the context of his help. To her, he was simply a benefactor who'd appeared at the right moment. Emily knew the truth, that Richard was a broken man seeking redemption, that his generosity came with 20 years of abandonment attached. When they returned, Sarah had another request. "Can I hug you, Mr. Angel? Miss Emily says you're very sick and hugs sometimes help people feel better." Richard looked to Emily for permission, and she nodded slightly. Sarah carefully climbed onto the bed and wrapped her small arms around Richard's neck. The hug broke something in Richard, some final wall he'd built around his heart. He held this little girl that his daughter was adopting, this child who represented Emily's capacity for love, despite everything he'd done, and he wept openly. Sarah pulled back, concerned. "Did I hurt you? I'm sorry." Richard shook his head, smiling through tears. "No, sweetheart, you didn't hurt me. These are happy tears because I'm grateful I got to meet you." Sarah seemed satisfied with this explanation and returned to her chair, pulling out a coloring book Emily had brought. As Sarah colored contentedly, Emily moved closer to Richard's bedside. "She doesn't know you're my father," Emily said quietly. "I thought that would be too confusing for her right now. She just knows you're the benefactor who funded her treatment." Richard nodded, understanding. "Whatever you think is best. Does she know you and I have history?" Emily shook her head. "I told her you're an old family friend I'd lost touch with. I didn't want her to know about the complications, the abandonment. She's been through enough trauma without processing adult relationship dysfunction." Richard appreciated Emily's protectiveness over Sarah, even if it meant concealing his role in their lives. As the visit continued, Richard observed Emily with Sarah and saw the kind of mother Emily had become, patient, attentive, setting gentle boundaries while encouraging independence. When Sarah asked for a snack, Emily produced healthy options from her bag. When Sarah grew tired and cranky, Emily recognized the signs and suggested they head home for nap time. "Can we come back and visit Mr. Angel again?" Sarah asked as they prepared to leave. Emily looked to Richard, the question hanging between them. "If Mr. Stone feels up to visitors, maybe we can come back in a few days," Emily said diplomatically, giving them both an out. "I'd like that very much," Richard said, "if you're willing." After they left, Richard lay in his bed holding Sarah's card, marveling at the strange turn his life had taken. He'd gone from corporate titan to dying man to Mr. Angel in the eyes of a child he'd saved. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd lived his entire life chasing legacy, building an empire so people would remember his name, but the most meaningful thing he'd ever done was an anonymous donation to save one little girl's life. Everything else, the billions, the buildings bearing his name, the business deals, suddenly seemed hollow in comparison to the crayon drawing of an angel holding hands with his daughter and granddaughter. Emily established a pattern of visiting twice a week, sometimes with Sarah, sometimes alone. The visits with Sarah were lighter, filled with childish chatter and coloring sessions. The visits without Sarah were deeper, more painful, as Emily continued to work through her complicated feelings about Richard's abandonment and recent interventions. During one particularly difficult conversation, Emily confronted him about his second wife, Catherine. "Did you love her?" Emily asked bluntly. "Did you love her more than you loved me and Mom?" Richard considered lying to spare Emily's feelings, but he'd promised honesty. "I thought I did. She made me feel young, powerful, desired, but it wasn't real love. It was infatuation and ego. She left me within 3 years, once she realized my money came with expectations and my health was declining. Real love, what I had with Sarah, what I should have cherished with you, that endures. What I felt for Catherine was selfish and shallow." Emily absorbed this. So you destroyed our family for an infatuation that didn't even last. You traded me for someone who abandoned you the moment you were no longer convenient. The parallel wasn't lost on either of them. Richard had abandoned Emily when she became inconvenient, then experienced the same abandonment himself. Karma, Richard said simply. I got exactly what I deserved. As Richard's condition worsened, their conversations became more urgent, more raw. Emily asked questions she'd carried for 20 years, and Richard answered with brutal honesty, no longer concerned with protecting his image or ego. Did you ever think about reaching out before the cancer diagnosis? Emily asked during one visit. Richard nodded. Constantly, every birthday, every holiday, every major milestone I imagined you experiencing. I'd draft emails or letters and never send them. I'd pick up the phone and set it down without dialing. I told myself I was respecting your space, that you were better off without me, but really I was just a coward afraid of your rejection. Emily leaned back in her chair. I would have rejected you. If you'd reached out 5 years ago, or 10, I would have told you to go to hell. I was still too angry, too hurt. There's something perverse about the fact that you waited until you were dying, because now I can't stay angry without feeling guilty. You're forcing my hand by being terminal. Richard hadn't thought of it that way, but she was right. His timing had effectively manipulated her into engaging with him, because refusing to reconcile with a dying man carried a different moral weight than refusing to reconcile with a healthy one. I'm sorry, Richard said, and meant it in a way he'd never meant anything before. I'm sorry for the abandonment, for the manipulation, for the surveillance, for the lies, for dying at a time that makes everything more complicated for you. I'm sorry for every way I've failed you, past and present. You don't owe me forgiveness. You don't owe me peace. You don't owe me anything. Emily's eyes filled with tears. But that's the problem. I do feel like I owe you something. You saved Sarah's life. You've supported the community center. You've helped dozens of people through your anonymous interventions. How do I balance the father who destroyed me against the benefactor who saved others? How do I hold both truths at once? Richard reached for her hand, surprised when she didn't pull away. Maybe you don't balance them. Maybe you just acknowledge that people are complicated, capable of both terrible harm and genuine good. I was a terrible father. That's true. I've tried to do some good in my final months. That's also true. Both things exist simultaneously, and you're allowed to feel however you feel about that without resolving it into one clean narrative. Emily squeezed his hand gently. I hate that you're dying. I hate that I'm feeling grief for a father who didn't earn it. I hate that I'm going to cry at your funeral, even though part of me still wants to scream at you. The conversations weren't all heavy. Sometimes Emily shared stories about her work at the community center, her students' successes, her plans for expanding the program. Richard listened hungrily to these stories, proud of what she'd built despite his failures. She told him about her Tuesday and Thursday routines, the same nights he'd been too busy for her as a child, now transformed into something beautiful. I think I chose those nights specifically, Emily admitted. Some unconscious part of me was reclaiming the time you'd made me feel unimportant, turning it into the nights where I show kids they matter, where I give them the attention you couldn't give me. Richard saw the poetry in it, the way Emily had transformed her wounds into sources of strength. You're a better person than I ever was, he said simply. Emily shook her head. I'm a different person. I had to be, to survive what you put me through. I don't know if I'm better or worse, just different. She paused. Sometimes I wonder who I would have been if you hadn't abandoned me. Would I have become a doctor? Would I be arrogant and entitled like you were? Would I have your work ethic but none of your compassion, because I'd never learned what suffering felt like? Richard had wondered the same thing, whether his abandonment had inadvertently created the compassionate, resilient woman Emily had become. With less than a week left to live, according to his doctors, Richard asked Emily to bring his lawyer to the hospital. I need to explain my will to you, he said. I need you to understand my intentions. Emily looked uncomfortable. I don't want to talk about your money. Richard pressed forward anyway. The bulk of my estate, roughly $38 billion, is going to you and Sarah. There are also substantial trusts for the community center, scholarships in your adoptive mother's name, and endowments for pediatric cancer research. Sterling Industries will be sold, with proceeds divided among charitable causes you'll oversee if you choose. Emily's face went pale. No, absolutely not. I don't want your money. I didn't reconcile with you for an inheritance. Richard had anticipated this reaction. I know. But Sarah deserves security. The community center deserves sustainable funding, and you've earned the right to never worry about money again, to never have to work 3 jobs or sacrifice your health for survival. This isn't a bribe or a manipulation. It's restitution for the 20 years I should have supported you but didn't. Emily stood abruptly, pacing the room. You're doing it again. Making decisions about my life, overwhelming me with gestures so large I can't refuse them. $40 billion. That's not restitution. That's control from beyond the grave. Richard saw her point but held firm. Then change the will. Direct the money however you want. Give it all away if that feels right to you. But I can't die knowing I've left you struggling when I have the means to ensure you never struggle again. Please, Emily. This is the only thing I can still do for you. Let me do it. Emily stopped pacing, her expression a mixture of frustration and resignation. Fine, but I'm not keeping it all. Most of it goes to causes that actually matter, to kids like Sarah, to community centers like ours, to people you exploited through your business practices over the years. I'll accept enough to secure Sarah's future and ensure I can focus on meaningful work instead of survival. The rest gets redistributed. Richard smiled weakly. That's exactly what I hoped you'd say. You're going to do more good with that money than I ever did. Emily returned to her chair, sitting heavily. I wish you'd been this person 20 years ago. I wish you'd chosen compassion and humility before you were forced to by terminal illness. We could have had decades together instead of these few painful weeks. Richard nodded, tears streaming down his gaunt face. I wish that too. It's my greatest regret. Not that I'm dying, but that I wasted so much time being the wrong version of myself. But Emily, these few weeks with you, meeting Sarah, seeing what you've built, they've meant everything to me. They've given my life meaning it didn't have before. Emily wiped her own tears. That's not fair. You don't get to die at peace while I'm left with all this unresolved complexity. Richard managed a weak laugh. You're right. Nothing about this is fair. I'm sorry for that too. Richard's final days arrived faster than anyone expected. His body was shutting down, and the doctors increased his morphine to manage the pain. Emily visited daily now, sometimes sitting in silence beside his bed, sometimes reading aloud from books they'd both loved when she was young. During one of these visits, Richard asked her a question that had been haunting him. Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive me? Not now necessarily, but someday. Emily set down her book, considering the question carefully. I don't know. Part of me has already forgiven you. The part that understands you were broken and flawed. The part that sees how hard you tried to make amends at the end. But another part of me is still that 15-year-old girl watching her father walk away. And she's not ready to forgive. Maybe I'll carry both of those parts forever, in conflict with each other. Richard nodded, accepting this honest answer. That's fair. Forgiveness isn't something you owe me, or something I can earn with grand gestures. It's something that happens on its own timeline, if it happens at all. Emily reached for his hand, holding it gently. What I can give you is this: peace. I'm at peace with you dying. Not happy about it, but not consumed by bitterness either. We've said what needed to be said. That's more than most people get. Sarah visited one last time, bringing more drawings and a stuffed bear she insisted Richard keep. So, you won't be lonely, she explained with the simple wisdom of childhood. Richard accepted the bear, placing it beside him on the bed where he could see it. Sarah climbed up carefully, avoiding the wires and tubes, and cuddled against Richard's side. Miss Emily says you're going to become an angel for real soon, Sarah whispered. A real one, with wings who lives in heaven. Richard glanced at Emily, who stood nearby with tears streaming down her face. "That's right, sweetheart," Richard said softly. "And from heaven, I'll watch over you and Emily, making sure you're both safe and happy." Sarah seemed comforted by this explanation. "Will you see my mommy in heaven? My first mommy who died?" Richard's throat tightened. "Yes, I think I will. And I'll tell her what an amazing daughter she has, and how lucky she was to have you." Sarah smiled. "Tell her I miss her, but I'm okay now, because I have a new mommy who loves me just as much." Emily covered her mouth, suppressing a sob. Richard met her eyes over Sarah's head, seeing the weight of responsibility and love she carried for this child. After Sarah left, Emily broke down completely, collapsing into the chair beside Richard's bed. "I can't do this," she sobbed. "I can't lose another parent, even one who barely deserves the title. I can't watch you die. I can't be strong anymore." Richard wished he had the strength to hold her, to comfort her the way a father should. "You don't have to be strong," he whispered. "You're allowed to fall apart. You're allowed to grieve, to be angry, to feel whatever you're feeling without judgment." Emily lifted her tear-stained face. "Why does it hurt so much? Why am I grieving for you when you caused me so much pain?" Richard understood this paradox intimately. Because love doesn't die just because it's wounded. You loved me once when you were young, before I betrayed that love. That original love is still there, buried under layers of hurt and anger. You're not just grieving who I am now, you're grieving who I could have been, who we could have been together if I'd made different choices. Emily nodded, recognizing the truth in his words. "I'm grieving the father I deserved, but never had. The father I glimpsed in these final weeks, the one who should have existed all along." Richard felt the devastating accuracy of her insight. "I'm sorry I only became that father when I ran out of time to be him properly." Marcus visited that evening, bringing documents for Richard to sign and final arrangements to confirm. After the business was concluded, Marcus sat beside Richard's bed with the familiarity of a long friendship. "You did something good here, Richard," Marcus said quietly. "With Emily, with Sarah, with the community center, it doesn't erase the past, but it matters." Richard wasn't sure he agreed. "I manipulated everything. I played God with their lives without their consent." "How is that good?" Marcus leaned back thoughtfully. "Because your intentions were pure, even if your methods were flawed. You were trying to heal wounds you caused, trying to ease suffering you had the power to address. Yes, you could have been more transparent. But if you'd revealed yourself from the beginning, Emily would have refused your help out of pride. Sometimes manipulation serves love, even if it's ethically murky." Richard appreciated Marcus's attempt to absolve him, but he knew the truth was more complicated. "I did it for myself as much as for her. I needed to feel like a good person before I died. That's selfish, not noble." Marcus shrugged. "Maybe, but the outcome was still positive. Sarah is alive. Emily is thriving. Dozens of kids have better futures. Your motivation doesn't negate the results." That night, alone in his hospital room, Richard reflected on his life with brutal honesty. He'd built an empire, accumulated obscene wealth, commanded respect and fear in equal measure. But what had any of it mattered? The buildings bearing his name would be renamed, the business would be sold and dismantled, his fortune would be redistributed by Emily to people who actually needed it. In the end, the only meaningful thing he'd done was save Sarah's life and partially reconcile with his daughter. Everything else was noise, ego, vanity projects disguised as legacy. He thought about his own childhood, his demanding father who'd valued success over happiness, achievement over relationships. Richard had spent his life trying to prove himself to a man who'd been dead for 30 years, sacrificing his real family in pursuit of approval from a ghost. He'd repeated the cycle, teaching Emily that love was conditional, that worth was measured in achievements rather than character. But somehow, miraculously, Emily had broken that cycle. She'd chosen compassion over ambition, People over profit, love over legacy. She'd become everything he'd failed to be, and she'd done it without his guidance, perhaps because of his absence, rather than despite it. That thought offered some small comfort, as he felt his body continuing to fail. Emily arrived early the next morning, and Richard could see in her face that she knew time was running out. She carried a photo album he recognized, the one from her childhood, filled with pictures of happier times when they'd been a family. "I thought we could look at these together," Emily said, settling into her usual chair. "Remember when things were good?" They spent the morning reviewing memories, birthday parties, vacations, school events where Richard had actually shown up. "You were a good father once," Emily said, pausing on a photo of Richard teaching her to ride a bike. "Before the ambition consumed you, before the second marriage, you were present. You cared. I want to remember that version of you existed, not just the one who abandoned me." Richard studied the photo, barely recognizing the man he'd been. Younger, happier, focused on his daughter instead of his phone. What happened to him? He wondered aloud. Emily turned the page. Life happened. Choices happened. You prioritized the wrong things, and by the time you realized it, you'd already lost what mattered most. She paused on another photo, Emily's middle school graduation, where Richard stood stiffly in his business suit, clearly impatient to return to the office. This was the beginning of the end. You were physically present, but emotionally absent. I remember feeling invisible that day, like I was an obligation you were checking off your list. Richard remembered that day differently, or rather, he didn't remember it much at all. It had been one of hundreds of events he'd attended without truly being present, his mind always on the next deal, the next conquest, the next achievement. "I was so afraid of being ordinary," Richard confessed. "My father drilled into me that successful men sacrifice everything for their ambitions. Family, health, happiness, all secondary to building something that would outlast you. I believed that lie for so long that I forgot to question it." Emily closed the album. "And now you're dying, and none of those sacrifices matter. The empire you built is being dismantled. The name you tried to immortalize will fade. But this," she gestured between them, "these conversations, this messy, painful reconciliation, this actually matters. This is the only real thing you've done in decades." Richard absorbed the harsh truth of her words. "I wasted my life chasing the wrong things. But you've lived yours chasing the right ones. That gives me some comfort, knowing that my failure produced someone who understood what actually mattered." Emily's expression softened. "I learned what mattered by experiencing its absence. Your neglect taught me the value of presence. Your conditional love taught me to love unconditionally. Your materialism taught me that people matter more than possessions. So in a perverse way, you did teach me important lessons, just not the ones you intended." The hours blurred together as Richard drifted in and out of consciousness, the morphine creating strange dreams where past and present merged. He saw Emily as a child, laughing and innocent, then transforming into the woman she'd become, strong, wounded, compassionate. He saw both Sarahs, his ex-wife who'd loved him despite his flaws, and the little girl his daughter was adopting. He saw himself from outside his body, a dying old man surrounded by the wreckage of his choices, clinging to the forgiveness he didn't deserve, but desperately craved. When he woke, Emily was still there, reading quietly beside his bed. "How long was I asleep?" he rasped. Emily checked her watch. "About 3 hours. It's early evening now." Richard felt the end approaching, a heaviness in his chest that had nothing to do with physical pain. "I need to tell you something," he said urgently. "While I still can." Emily set down her book, giving him her full attention. "I'm listening." Richard gathered his remaining strength. "You were the best thing I ever did. Not the business, not the fortune, not any achievement the world celebrated. You, adopting you with Sarah, watching you grow, being your father even for the brief time before I ruined it. That was my life's greatest accomplishment. And I threw it away like it meant nothing." Emily's eyes filled with tears. You can't say things like that now at the end and expect it to fix everything. Richard shook his head weakly. I don't expect it to fix anything. I just need you to know, whatever happens after I die, however you remember me, I want you to know that you were loved. Imperfectly, inadequately, but genuinely. I loved you even when I failed to show it, even when I actively hurt you. That doesn't excuse my behavior, but it's true. Emily wiped her tears angrily. Love without action is meaningless. Love that hurts more than it heals isn't really love at all. Richard accepted this judgment. You're right. I loved you the way I was capable of loving, which was broken and selfish and insufficient. You deserve better. Sarah deserves better. Every child deserves a parent whose love is active, present, unconditional. I wish I'd been that parent. Emily took a shaky breath. Me too. But we don't get to rewrite history. We only get to acknowledge it and try to do better going forward. Richard understood she was talking about her own parenting now, her determination to break the cycle with Sarah. You will do better. You already are. That little girl is going to grow up knowing she's loved unconditionally. She'll never doubt her worth, because you'll show her every day through your actions, not just your words. As night fell, Emily called Mrs. Patterson and arranged for Sarah to stay with her overnight. I want to be here, Emily explained to Richard. At the end, despite everything, I don't want you to die alone. Richard felt overwhelming gratitude for this undeserved grace. Thank you, he whispered, for staying, for giving me these final weeks, for being the better person. Emily settled into the reclining chair beside his bed, wrapping herself in a blanket the nurse provided. I'm not doing this for you, she said quietly. I'm doing it for me, so I don't have regrets later, so I can tell Sarah I was here, so I can say goodbye to the father you should have been, if not the father you were. Richard understood and accepted this distinction. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the beeping of monitors and the distant activity of the hospital. Richard felt himself slipping away, the edges of consciousness blurring. Emily, he said suddenly, urgently. Yes? She moved closer, taking his hand. Tell Sarah. Tell her that loving someone means staying, even when it's hard. Tell her that love is action, not just feeling. Be the parent I couldn't be. Break the cycle I couldn't break. Emily squeezed his hand. I will. I promise. Richard felt peace washing over him, the pain receding as his body began its final shutdown. I'm proud of you, he whispered. Thank you for being here. Thank you for everything. And then, holding his daughter's hand, Richard Sterling closed his eyes for the last time.